the stage lights dim to black. Somewhere in the darkness, a voice cuts through the silence, weathered, knowing, carrying decades of rock and roll wisdom. Ozzy sacrificed his health for rock and roll, Alice Cooper says, his words hanging in the air like smoke from a cigarette burned down to its filter. It's a statement that stops you cold, because when the godfather of shock rock speaks about sacrifice, you listen. Picture this: two legends, both architects of heavy metal's darkest corners, sitting across from each other. One, Alice Cooper, managed to tame his demons and find sobriety. The other, Ozzy Osbourne, became rock's most notorious casualty, a man who turned self-destruction into high art. But Alice's words weren't spoken with judgment. They carried something far more profound: the recognition of a warrior who chose the battlefield over his own body, again and again and again. To understand what Alice Cooper means when he talks about Ozzy's sacrifice, you have to go back to the beginning, back to 1970, when a skinny kid from Birmingham named John Michael Osbourne stumbled onto a stage that would become his altar, his confessional, and ultimately his cross to bear. The year was 1970, and Black Sabbath was about to change music forever. In a dingy rehearsal room in Birmingham, four working-class kids were crafting something the world had never heard before: music that was darker, heavier, more dangerous than anything that came before. Ozzy wasn't just the voice of this revolution. He was its beating heart, its tortured soul made manifest. But even then, you could see the seeds of what Alice Cooper would later call sacrifice. While other frontmen protected their voices, Ozzy screamed until his throat bled. While others maintained their image, Ozzy threw himself into performances with a reckless abandon that bordered on self-harm. He didn't just sing about darkness, he invited it in, made it comfortable, gave it a permanent address in his body and soul. Alice Cooper watched this transformation from afar, recognizing something of himself in Ozzy's theatrical madness. But where Alice learned to separate the character from the man, Ozzy merged with his stage persona until you couldn't tell where John Osbourne ended and the Prince of Darkness began. It was brilliant. It was revolutionary. It was also slowly killing him. The stories became legend almost immediately. Ozzy biting the head off a bat during a performance in Des Moines in 1982. An accident that became his calling card. Ozzy snorting ants by a hotel pool. Ozzy urinating on the Alamo while wearing his wife's dress. Each incident added another layer to the mythology, but stripped away another piece of the man underneath. Alice Cooper understood something that fans couldn't see from the audience. Every outrageous act, every boundary crossed, every line obliterated came at a cost. The thing about Ozzy, Alice would reflect years later, is that he never learned to turn it off. That character consumed him because he let it. He sacrificed his peace of mind, his health, his stability, all for the sake of being the ultimate rock and roll creature. By the mid-1970s, Ozzy's substance abuse had escalated beyond recreational use. It wasn't about getting high anymore. It was about survival. The stage demanded everything from him, and when the stage went dark, the bottles and pills were there to fill the void. He was medicating trauma, anxiety, and a sensitivity that made him perfect for music, but terrible for the music business. Sharon Ardenu would later become Sharon Osbourne saw this better than anyone when she took over managing Ozzy's solo career in 1979. She inherited a man who was equal parts genius and walking disaster. She watched him create some of the most iconic music in heavy metal history while simultaneously destroying himself cell by cell, drink by drink, pill by pill. The early solo albums, Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, captured Ozzy at his most vulnerable and most dangerous. Songs like Crazy Train and Mr. Crowley weren't just anthems. They were confessions. He was singing about his own mental state, his own demons. his own descent into a madness that was both theatrical and terrifyingly real. Alice Cooper saw all of this unfold with the unique perspective of someone who'd walked a similar path. The difference between us, Alice would later explain, is that I created Alice Cooper as a character I could step into and out of. Ozzy became his character. He sacrificed the safety of separation. The 1980s brought Ozzy unprecedented success, but also unprecedented chaos. His performances became more erratic, more dangerous. He would black out on stage, sometimes not remembering entire concerts. There were nights when Sharon had to hold her breath, wondering if her husband would make it through the performance alive. The infamous incident where Ozzy nearly died trying to kill Sharon while blackout drunk in 1989 was a wake-up call that almost came too late. He was arrested, spent time in jail, and for a brief moment it seemed like the music industry might finally lose its most unpredictable star. But Ozzy survived, and somehow Sharon forgave him. The sacrifice continued. What Alice Cooper recognized, what perhaps only another performer of his caliber could understand, was that Ozzy's destruction wasn't random or senseless. It was systematic. It was the methodical dismantling of a human being in service to something larger than himself, the myth, the music, the moment that rock and roll demanded. Every rehab stint was followed by a relapse. Every promise to get clean was broken by the next tour, the next album, the next opportunity to feed the machine that had consumed him. Ozzy wasn't just battling addiction, he was battling the fundamental contradiction of his existence. He needed to be broken to create. But being broken was killing him. The turn of the millennium brought the Osbournes, a reality TV show that gave the world an unprecedented look into Ozzy's daily life. What they saw was both hilarious and heartbreaking. Man whose mind had been so altered by decades of abuse that simple tasks had become monumental challenges. He shuffled through his mansion like a ghost, mumbling incoherently, struggling to complete basic sentences. Alice Cooper watched this period with a mixture of amusement and deep concern. That show was brilliant television, he would say. But it was also a documentary about what happens when you sacrifice everything for rock and roll. Ozzy had given so much of himself to the music that there wasn't much of the original person left. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps Ozzy's sacrifice was always meant to be complete. He had transformed himself into something beyond human, a living embodiment of rock and roll's most extreme impulses. He was no longer just John Osbourne from Birmingham. Kay was a mythological figure, a cautionary tale, and an inspiration rolled into one trembling, mumbling package. The health problems began piling up like unpaid bills. Parkinson's disease diagnosis in 2003, though later corrected to Parkinson's syndrome. Multiple surgeries, falls that left him broken and bleeding. A body that had been pushed so far beyond its limits that it was beginning to shut down in protest. Yet still, Ozzy continued to perform, continued to give everything he had to audiences who demanded nothing less than total commitment. Alice Cooper's assessment wasn't harsh. It was admiring. Look at what he accomplished, Alice would reflect. He changed music forever. He influenced generations of performers. He became immortal. But immortality came at the price of mortality. He sacrificed his body, his mind, his peace, all so that rock and roll could have its perfect martyr. The recent years have been a study in determination and decline. Ozzy announced his final tour, No More Tours 2, in 2018, but like every retirement announcement before it, this one seemed more aspirational than definitive. Because, how do you retire from being yourself? How do you stop being the thing you've sacrificed everything to become? Watching Ozzy perform in his 70s is both inspiring and heartbreaking. His body may be failing, his speech may be slurred. His movements may be uncertain, but when those lights hit and the music starts, something magnificent and terrible happens. The sacrifice pays dividends. Ozzy Osbourne transcends his physical limitations and becomes pure rock and roll energy. Alice Cooper understands this better than most. People ask me why Ozzy keeps going when he can barely walk. Alice says, but they're missing the point. He keeps going because he can barely walk. The sacrifice isn't complete until there's nothing left to give. There's something almost religious about this complete surrender of self, to art, to audience, to the unforgiving demands of rock and roll immortality. Ozzy didn't just perform music, he became a living sacrifice on the altar of rock and roll, offering up pieces of himself night after night, year after year, decade after decade. Sharon has been both witness and enabler, protector and collaborator in this long, slow sacrifice. She's kept him alive while allowing him to continue dying for his art. It's a contradiction that would destroy most relationships. But their love story is built on the understanding that Ozzy's sacrifice was never optionally, was essential. To who he is, the influence of Ozzy's sacrifice can be seen in every metal band that followed. They learned that authenticity in rock and roll sometimes requires you to go to places that normal people can't return from, that the audience can smell fear and fakeness from the back row. So if you're going to embody darkness, you better be willing to let it consume you. But Alice Cooper's observation carries a warning as well as admiration. The new generation needs to understand. Alice says, you don't have to sacrifice everything to be authentic. Ozzy did it, so you don't have to. He showed us what complete commitment looks like, but he also showed us what it costs. Today, as Ozzy continues to battle his declining health, Alice Cooper's words take on prophetic weight. The sacrifice was real. It was complete. And it was, in its own twisted way, beautiful. Ozzy Osbourne gave everything he had to rock and roll gave him everything: back fame, fortune, love, legacy, and a kind of immortality that most artists only dream of. The lights are dimming on Ozzy's career now, not by choice, but by the simple reality that even the most dedicated sacrifice has limits. His body, pushed beyond all reasonable expectations for over 50 years, is finally demanding payment for decades of abuse. The tremors, the falls, the confusion, these are the final installments on a debt that's been accumulating since that first Black Sabbath rehearsal in Birmingham. But Alice Cooper's assessment remains both tribute and truth. Ozzy Osbourne sacrificed his health for rock and roll, and in doing so, he created something that will outlive the body that housed it. He transformed from John Michael Osbourne, a shy kid from working-class Birmingham, into something eternal and mythical. The sacrifice was complete, total, and ultimately successful. When the final curtain falls and the last note fades, what will remain is the music, the legend, and the unmistakable truth that some artists give everything to their art. Ozzy Osbourne didn't just perform rock and roll. He became its living embodiment, its ultimate sacrifice, its perfect martyr. And in losing himself, he found a kind of immortality that no amount of health or normalcy could have purchased. Alice Cooper knew what he was talking about when he spoke those words. He was describing not just a career choice, but a spiritual transformation, the complete surrender of one man's humanity so that rock and roll could have its most perfect, most damaged, most beautiful saint.